Good afternoon, and I am very, very pleased to have the opportunity to come back to Cairo. I was a relatively regular visitor before, but then you had a revolution and our program came to an end. And so the opportunity is dried up. So thank you very much for letting me have this return visit. I was asked by the organizers to talk about gender segmentation of the labor market, and that was what I was going to do, and that is what I am going to do. But I had originally thought I would do a very general overview. But I realized I've been doing general overviews for quite a long time, and that I was really bored listening to myself, saying the same things again and again. So I've decided to go from the broad global overview to a very specific case study, which is a case study of gender labor markets in Bangladesh. Now, one of the reasons I was coming to Egypt as often as I was we were doing a comparative study of economic empowerment using survey data from Egypt, Bangladesh, and Ghana. And the strength of that study was that we were using very similar questions, ones that did make sense in all three contexts. But of course, each survey also had its own definitions of what was important. So I'm not going to be talking about Egypt, but Bangladesh, like Egypt, is a Muslim majority country. It has certain aspects of similar cultures. So from that point of view, I hope it will be of use to people working on the MENA region. And before I launch into my own presentation, I'd just like to show you some of the differences. The growth rates in recent years have been very similar, but as you can see, Egypt is far wealthier. 2009, 2010, sorry. What is interesting about Bangladesh is, of course, that we have had huge progress at primary and secondary levels of education, but if I'd had the data for Egypt on tertiary, I suspect that you have many more women in tertiary level than we do in Bangladesh. Female labor force participation rates, as we've been talking about, a really problematic area. And I don't know what we're comparing there, what kind of statistics, but this is from the World Bank data set. What I also wanted to share is some of the attitudes that we found from our Pathways survey. And as you will see, Egypt had much lower levels of sun preference expressed by women in the different work categories. And that was formal wage labor, informal wage labor, and so on. In Bangladesh, between 30–40% of women expressed sun preference. In Egypt, it was much lower. But women in Bangladesh seem to express a greater, this is a question from the World Values Survey, women in Bangladesh seem to feel a greater sense of control over their lives. And again, one doesn't know how to interpret it, but in all three of our surveys, this variable, feeling a sense of control of your life, proved to be an extremely important way of differentiating women in different forms of work. Okay, so that's the kind of background. The survey we did in Bangladesh was in 2008, and we surveyed over 5,000 women in 8 different districts in Bangladesh. It was largely randomly selected, and it's reasonably representative. The thing about the Bangladesh story is an interesting one. Is that it has gone from being known as an international basket case or trapped in a low-level equilibrium to, respectable rates of growth, steady declines in poverty, and some quite interesting progress on the social development front. So we've seen rise of female education, girls overtaking boys at lower levels, very dramatic fertility decline, steady improvements in maternal mortality, closing of the gender gap in under 5 mortality, and we have seen a decline in the phenomenon of missing women, which I think you've also seen a decline here in Egypt, and a possible revaluation of daughters in a positive way. We've also seen a steady rise in female labor force participation rates from about 4% in the 70s to 36% according to the 2010 labor force survey. But, and here is the kind of thing we want to study, most women are in unpaid family labor. And there has been an inexplicable rise in unpaid family labor over the past decades. So as you can see, it's been rising for both. It's been a bit stagnant for men, but it's been rising steadily for women. But This is the 2005 statistics, and you will see that 64% of working women were in unpaid family labor in 2005, and it risen to 77% in 2010. So that was what we were puzzled by. And we were puzzled for a number of reasons, is that, and I've done an overview of studies in different kinds of work, other people's studies, and it is very clear that women who work outside, especially in wage employment, garment factories and so on, perform better on a range of indicators of empowerment, including domestic violence. Women who work within the home are much less likely to make decisions, are much less likely to be mobile in the public domain, and so on and so forth. And our own data, our own survey suggested that women in paid employment performed better on a range of indicators within the family and at the personal level, including this business of feeling control over your own life. And the qualitative interviews also, a lot of women emphasized how important it was for women to have some income of their own. And one statement which I liked very much by a woman who was not earning, she said, you can tell as soon as you see a working woman, if women work and earn an income of their own, there is a different sense about them. They seem to have a mental strength. You know, they come over as more confident. So then why are so many women in home-based work and unpaid family labor, which appears to have the least empowerment potential? So this was what we tried to find out using our survey data, which was very rich and could lend itself to, addressing a number of questions. And what we wanted to do is ask, what is it that explains why women are in the labor force in the first place? And then what is it that explains why women are in different forms of work, wage employment, self-employment, and so on? Now, just as a background, one of the best studies on this issue in Bangladesh is still, I think, a study carried out in the 1970s by Mead Kane. And it was a very sophisticated, and I'm very pleased we had it, because you can always refer back to it for an interesting theoretical framework. And he said that the market for women's labor is physically and functionally demarcated. And I don't know if this would apply in parts of Egypt as well. The physical limits of the market are described by a circle of 200 to 400 meters within the homestead. And geographically, the market for any woman's labor is very small. And the pool of potential employers is limited by the condition that there's some sort of prior relationship with the employer. Norms of parda will influence the distance a woman would be willing to travel, the distance a husband would allow her to travel, her willingness to work for a stranger, and the receptivity of potential employers. So what he was pointing out was a combination of internalized constraints and externally imposed constraints. And I think that was a very, nuanced analysis of decomposing this idea of parda into all its different kinds of components, the physical, the psychological, and so on. Now, what the typical patterns have been is that in the countries with female seclusion, very often it is the very poorest women who are found in paid work. They cannot afford to stay at home. They cannot afford to be economically inactive. Patriarchal risk, women who are widows or separated or divorced and have no male breadwinner are much more likely to be working. So often female-headed households. Married women with and without children are less likely to participate. And there tends to be a U-shaped relationship between women's education and their labor force participation, so that the highest levels of labor force participation are to be found amongst women with no education and women with post-secondary education. The ones with primary and secondary tend to have very depressed rates of participation. Now, official statistics, as we know, consistently underestimate women's work. And what we did is we took the official definition of labor force participation, which is used by the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics, and we used that definition in our survey. But we trained our enumerators, I think, far better than the Bureau of Statistics does. And as a result, we found a very different set of estimates. So while the Bureau of Statistics estimate for the areas in which we studied was 30%, using the same reference period of 7 days, we got to 67%. Increasing it to a year took us to 73%, which is not that different and suggests that women may do these irregular kinds of work, but they do it throughout the year. But it's clear that the difference between our and the labor force official statistics is around work within the home. Because our estimates of paid work outside the home was just 10%. So it is very low, and that big leap in our estimates is largely due to home-based work, paid and unpaid. We divided our categories of women into different work categories. And what becomes very clear is these are very distinctive socio-demographic economic people. So women in formal, semi-formal work, which is garment workers, working for NGOs, working for the government, working for services and so on, were the most educated, relatively wealthy, often married, but some single women. Women in informal waged work were the poorest. They came from the poorest sectors, they had least education, they were more likely to be female-headed households than others, and so on. Women in informal self-employment outside the home, petty trade, services of various kinds on their own, were generally married and with quite low levels of education, and the same for the other categories. The interesting one are the economically active, inactive, who came from one of the wealthiest households and were also most likely to be widowed. I think 70% of them were widowed. But my suspicion is, given that their average age was the same as for the rest of the sample, my suspicion is a lot of women who are divorced or abandoned call themselves widowed. So this 70% of women who are widowed is probably also including women who are divorced and separated and abandoned. And they came from relatively wealthy households. Okay. My colleague on the team, James Hines, is an econometrician, so we handed over this next bit of the research to him, and he did whatever it is that econometricians do. And he did two separate estimates. The first was just a one-step regression, a probit regression, looking at what is it that predicts that women will be in the labor force. And we find it's, goes up with age and then declines. We find female-headed households are more likely to be active. We find that household wealth and the education of the household head is associated with lower levels of education. It is likely to be an income effect. We find that employed household heads are also likely to report employed women, and that is because inactive heads are older and are also likely to report older women in their households. Muslim women, interestingly, had higher rates of labor force participation than Hindu women, but this may be because of our very inclusive definition of employment, of labor force participation, that it didn't differentiate between Muslims and Hindus. And village location was enormously important, which bit of Bangladesh you were in. There was huge variation across the country, which tells you something interesting, which we are going to try and investigate. Does that huge variation reflect demand structures, differences in opportunities, or does it reflect social norms? Does it reflect variations in NGO activity? We don't know. James then did a modified probit regression with maximum likelihood something or other. But the idea of that was to see, given that many women were not in the labor force, so he carried out a set of estimates that looked at if women were in the labor force, what predicts their likelihood of being in these different kinds of activities, okay? So this is estimates that relate to working women rather than to all women. And I'm going to summarize there. So we're now talking about the likelihood of working women being in different kinds of activities. And for simplicity's sake, we divided them into women working outside and inside the home, because that's the key distinction. Do you work outside or inside? And women working in wage employment and self-employment, okay? So because we had a very inclusive definition of labor force participation, key variations in labor force rates didn't show up in the overall estimates. They showed up instead in the kinds of work that women did, okay? So we found much more variation in the kinds of work that women did. So, as you would expect in this country, marriage continues to depress the likelihood of working outside the home. But unlike the past, single women are now much more likely to be economically active outside the home, along with the traditional category of divorced and widowed and abandoned women. So the single women participation is something new. Number of children under 5 did not affect participation, but women who reported care duties and domestic chores were much more likely to work within the home rather than outside the home. So there we have a very clear indication. If there are other substitutes within the home, then having a child under 5 doesn't matter. But if you have no one else to do these duties, you're much more likely to work at home. The U-shaped relationship that I talked about didn't come up in overall labor force participation, but it was very clear in types of work. So extremely poor women and extremely educated women were more likely to work outside the home. We saw Muslim women were more likely to be active, but Muslim women who wore the parda hijab outside the home were less likely to work outside the home, more likely to work within the home. Women who made their own decision as to whether they would work or not were more likely to be in self-employment than in wage employment, but not necessarily in home-based self-employment, but they were more likely to be in self-employment. Membership of microfinance reduced the likelihood of wage employment and increased the likelihood of self-employment. But access to loans had the reverse effect, which is odd. And it may be that the effects of access to loans was being captured by another set of variables, which is whether the household owned cattle and goats. A lot of loans are used for livestock enterprises. Where there were households with livestock, those women were much more likely to work within the home. So it may be that access to loans was not being captured because it was already being captured by livestock ownership. Hence, education and wealth of households reduced the likelihood of wage employment, but didn't increase the likelihood of paid work. And again, we go back to the income effect. Connectivity of various kinds, including ownership of a mobile phone and whether your house had electricity or not, increased the likelihood of waged work and outside work. Once again, location mattered enormously, and outside work or wage work was most likely to be found in peri-urban areas where you might have a government headquarters, NGO headquarters, garment factories. And the lowest levels of participation and outside work were found in the most socially conservative areas of Comilla. Okay, so the question, we now have a picture of the kinds of women who work outside the home and the kinds of women who work within the home. We wanted to look further within the survey to ask, is there anything else in the information contained that will help us to get an understanding of this inside-outside stuff? So women were asked what was their most preferred occupation. They said, in order, ranking, livestock and poultry rearing, tailoring, teaching, and quilt making and handicrafts. Their least preferred were working as domestics, daily wage labor, begging, and garment work. But what is interesting are the reasons they gave for their preferences and their aversions. The reasons for giving high ranking to an occupation was ability to work and earn within the home. 70 to 80% of women in these different categories said that was the reason they liked these other jobs. Considerations of respect and honor, 68%, but it was only teachers. You remember teaching was what? So 68% of women who said they ranked teaching highly said it was to do with the respect and honor. They didn't say it about the other jobs. They didn't say it about goat rearing and so on. And own consumption that you could produce for yourself. If we look at the reasons they gave for the low ranking of occupations, work outside the home, which would be the obverse of working within the home, was only mentioned by 10 to 21%, as opposed to 70 to 85% saying that's the reason they valued a job. But the reason they disliked a job was not that necessarily because it took them outside. It also reflected such things as how hard and demanding the labor was. So garment work was considered very difficult. The fact that you had to work as an agricultural laborer in the sun and the rain and the climate and so on. Garment work, 9% said it was because you had to work alongside men. 8 to 27% it said that people said bad things about you. 5 to 22%, this is different categories of work, said that people did not honor this work. And 22% who put domestic work as their least favored said it had no respect. Now, what is interesting, I think, about those two is that they're not symmetrical. That you would have thought if working within the home was valued for working within the home, then the most common reason for not liking a job would be that it took you outside the home. But it wasn't. It was about what other people said. It was about how the community assessed that job and evaluated that job. So it seemed to us that although the preferred jobs were all very home-based jobs, the reason for preferring those jobs was far more strongly related to the reasons for not liking the jobs they did not like. But the jobs they did not like, domestic service and agriculture and non-agricultural wage labor, actually made up the bulk of their wage labor opportunities outside the home. Moving on, we also found that women themselves valued or considered that other people valued these jobs very differently. So a high percentage of women in formal waged work said that they valued their own work, they considered it important, that their families valued their work, but the community did not, 28%. Those working outside the home, quite high, 69, 68, community did not. Informal inside, 53, 52, the community did not. So again, we're seeing something which came out in the empowerment work, that far more changes seem to have happened within the family, amongst male members of the family, amongst the family itself, than happened outside in the community. So on the basis of our study, we would say that community norms and attitudes are far more resilient and relevant to what women can and cannot do than our family behavior and attitudes. That's a speculation, but our data leads us to kind of come to that conclusion. Other barriers to outside work: women who worked outside were much more likely to face abuse at work and harassment. They were much more likely to report negative health effects. 30% of those in formal waged employment and 63% of those in informal waged employment, which is domestic service, agricultural wage labor, reported negative health effects. Then we talked about the community. Interestingly, we said that women who chose their own jobs were more likely to work in self-employment, whether within the home or not relevant. But women who reported resistance to their work decisions were likely to be younger and working in outside employment. There are other reasons why women find it quite hard to get the kind of jobs they would like, which is the kind of jobs we would all like, right? Not domestic service and not agricultural wage labor, but work in an NGO, work for the government and so on, are the hidden costs of accessing those jobs. There are bribes to be paid. And the idea that a woman would have the resources to pay the kind of bribe that you need to get a steady job is, of course, extremely unlikely. And then there are employers' attitudes, and I really like the paper from Egypt, Barsoum et al., who does a very detailed, and I think we need more of that kind of ethnographic work about employers' attitudes. To what extent are employers, for rational or irrational reasons, reproducing the gender segregation of jobs? I haven't done that work yet. We propose to do it. But there is one piece of work that asked employers, this is about 20 years ago, why women are not hired to harvest the main crops in rural districts. Employers were quite clear that the reasons for job segmentation, stating explicitly that they did not believe they had anything to gain from breaking with tradition. As long as male labor is available, employers do not think it is worth hiring female labor. And male labor is usually in abundant supply. This is changing, and in many districts of Bangladesh, you see women working in the fields, very often being paid in kind. So they may be working in the fields harvesting potatoes, but they will be paid in potatoes. You know, it's like the cash economy is not yet ready for them. And that was why the garment industry was such a break with tradition, because it gave them regular jobs, it gave them money, often it went into their own hands. So the question, I guess, to go back to, how many minutes have I got left? Pardon? 0 minutes. Okay, I've got 0 minutes, and I've got exactly enough to say to fill in those 0 minutes. So the question then is, we can see that there are a number of different forces that are acting to keep women in home-based work. We can also see that a lot of women are economically active, even if they are in home-based work. But I think a change has happened, a transition has happened, which is very linked to the kinds of jobs that we see women doing today, and that is the microfinance transition. Microfinance is now available across the country. And what microfinance has done, it has encouraged the move back into the home. And if you look at the kind of assessments that poorer women must make, you know, one hand you are a domestic laborer in someone's home or working in the fields. On the other hand, you can withdraw into the home, lose your voice a little bit, perhaps not make as many decisions as you did before, but you have a certain degree of security and safety. So I want to end with two quotes that came out of an evaluation I did of a microfinance program around the time where we were seeing a rise in women's waged work in the countryside. Not garments, but agricultural wage labor. And this is, I think, the reversal that has happened. And what she said, before these loans came, women used to work on other people's fields, cutting lentils, rice, and wheat. They got 10 to 20 to 30 takas. This is happening less now because so many women are getting loans. They're raising goats, cows, they can work for themselves, so why should they work for someone else? If you can work for yourself, I'm sitting with you, I could not have done that if I worked for someone else. They would pay me less then, I would pull up lentils, they would give me 20 takas a day. That was 4 years ago. They used to clear the eerie blocks, they would stand in water and get leeches on them. Now they don't, now the loans give them peace. And here is a woman talking about working as a domestic servant. Before I used to work in people's houses to eat. I worked all day for the stomach alone, not for money. So she didn't get cash in hand, she got food. Isn't it better to work in your own house rather than having to work in someone else's house just in order to fill your stomach? You stay at home, you raise ducks and hens, you feed yourself and you make some profit. There is no honor in working outside. So I think part of the story that we're seeing in Bangladesh is the double-edged impact of microfinance. The double-edged impact is that it has allowed economic opportunities to spread across this countryside. Many, many more women, and I suspect however we define work, we would still find higher rates of economic activity, paid activity in Bangladesh than in many other countries. But it has also, in a sense, subsidized the withdrawal into the home. And it has penalized the possibility of working in wage labor in alliance with market forces and so on. So I have a little bit of ambivalence, really, about that finding. Thank you.